Okay. Okay. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks so much for joining, and yeah, for having me here presenting today. So I might just start with a big old disclaimer. I'm a political scientist and a public policy person, so I'm not a psychologist or in basically the fields that you are all expert in. So the research, although we tackle issues of gender equality or sexuality or LGBTIQ plus experiences, they probably come from a different set of questions that you might be used to tackling, different lenses that you look through. However, there's probably quite a lot in similar, and hopefully this can be something interesting, and thanks again for inviting me for iHobbit. So I think it's been already shared a little bit about myself, but the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, as mentioned, or JUL, as we like to call ourselves, we are an interdisciplinary team of researchers. So we don't sit in one of the colleges at the ANU or in the Vice Chancellor's department, and that gives us basically an ability to have organisational and social psychologists, political scientists, management folk, economists, a whole range of people who work with us on these various topics. So while we do gender equality research primarily, we always do it from an intersectional lens, and LGBTIQ plus experiences and sexuality more broadly feature quite heavily in a lot of our research. So hopefully sharing some of the research here today, I just wanted to walk you through a combination of 3 studies, some that I have done just by myself and others that have been done as part of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And really to come at this question of who gets chosen to represent us. Now that might be in politics or other spheres of public or even private leadership. But when we kind of look past that representation, we know the literature speaks a lot to the fact that representation is not everything if we're talking about equality. So we've got swathes of research on people's experiences and how they might differ, or at least a growing set of research on this topic. But the reason why this question of representation and experiences is really interesting from a political science or a public policy background, is, if we know, the full range of human diversity and their experiences, yes, we can make better public policy. But also thinking about Australia as a democracy, as a representative democracy, there are fundamental constitutional implications if we fail to represent the state. And it also flows down into power. So who actually has the power to make decisions on behalf of Australia? So today, I thought that I'd take you through 3 studies. So one is looking at, well, for young people, young gender and sexuality diverse people, what are their engagements, or what's been their engagement with politics? What are their paths to politics? And so really looking at this research in terms of, we've got underrepresentation of women in politics generally. If you look at sexuality, this is actually an area of research that there's very little research on, but we have been doing a little bit around what people of diverse sexualities might be experiencing in political leadership. But also young people are typically underrepresented. So we really wanted to find out, okay, well, how are they engaging with politics? What are some of those parts? So what I want to talk about is looking at this concept of risky visibility, and how when LGBTIQ plus politicians do get into leadership, they do get, these very high profile positions, how does their harassment or discrimination or experiences differ from that of their non-queer colleagues? And then 3, research from my book and my PhD, which was all around who gets chosen to represent Australia overseas. And I did some of the first research that had ever been done on queer women specifically representing the nation. I'll run through some implications and reflections, but I also really encourage lots of questions. So feel free to hit me with them throughout or at the end. So starting with alternative paths to politics, we've published this report about 2 months ago now, based off this research, and we're in the midst of preparing papers for peer-reviewed publication. But in essence, At Jewel, we hosted a youth summit last October in collaboration with the Women of the World Festival in Brisbane. We gathered not a representative sample of Australians, but changemakers, people who specifically opted in, who were mostly women or gender minorities, who happen to have a high representation of identification with LGBTIQ+ identities, and people who were already engaged in politics in some manner. They might have been activists, or they've already run for politics, or they are doing some sort of different social advocacy and political advocacy. Now, we call this cohort change makers on purpose because we can't say from this research it's representative of all young gender diverse people and their political engagement. However, it does provide some insights into, of those who are already really engaged in politics, what have been some of their experiences? So as you can see, roughly it's about 40-ish%, just under 40% of participants describe their sexuality as LGBTIQ+ in some way. About 21% were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and we had a big contingent come who'd been brought from different regions of Australia, supported by the Australian Human Rights Commission. 92% describe their gender as female or a woman, 3% as agender, 2% as a male or man, and 2% as non-binary. We also had 6% who are trans. Median age was 25 years. Most participants were from metropolitan city areas. Most held Australian citizenship. Most were employed full-time. What we found, though, was that despite being really highly politically engaged young people, our change makers typically chased non-traditional paths and engagement with politics. So only 1% had actually run for politics and 4% had joined a political party. Their engagement with politics tended to be much more informal. It tended to be less secure in terms of financially secure, but also in other forms of security. It was much more focused on politics as an action rather than a career. And it involved all kinds of things, from artistic outputs, protests, petitions, fundraising, research, sharing on social media, developing resources like anti-racism toolkits, all that sort of thing. As opposed to maybe some of the research on older folk who are entering politics, rather than a career, politics is seen as an action. So in asking what does politics mean to our participants, you can see kind of a range of different definitions, tended to have a much more diverse picture of what political engagement looked like. And what we found was that if that might be considered informal politics and not generally recognised as kind of, I don't know, official or formal politics by, well, most of society, but even academia, then when we look at young people's formal engagement with kind of traditional political structures, we found that most aren't interested in running for politics yet or ever. So we asked whether they'd be interested in running as soon as they can. Majority, so almost 80% there, said no, not definitely not, or probably not. Slightly less said maybe in the next 5 or 10 years. And again, still a majority said no for any time in the future. When we look at participants who do say, yes, I want to run as soon as possible, these statistics are even lower than Plan International's research, which was over general representative young women in politics, who found that only 12% of young women said they'd pursue a career in national politics. So we're kind of starting to see this picture where young gender diverse women or LGBTIQ+ folk who are already really politically engaged, but they're not interested in running in politics either now or in the future. Some of the concerns are probably more or less what you'd expect. So climate change, Aboriginal rights, things like consent education, paid parental leave, workplace conditions, gender equality, so on and so forth. When it actually came to thinking then about, well, to what degree did they feel listened to or heard or represented in government, a huge minority said no, and most did not feel that any level of government was effective at advocating for their particular policy area. Interestingly though, that when we asked them about that kind of key selected policy concern, so whatever it might have been for them, we asked them, well, would it motivate you to take further political action if you thought that government actually wasn't adequate in these spaces? Now, what was interesting was that if up the top there is responses to, no, it doesn't motivate me to take any further political action. Out of the 4 demographic groups that we've kind of broken down there, purple being all respondents, the cream being LGBTIQ+ folk, the next one being people with disability, and the final being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. Both people with disability and LGBTIQ+ people, they were the least represented in that category of, no, it doesn't motivate me to take further action. When you look at, yes, it might influence my decision to take other political action, so not running for politics, but other, 82% of the LGBTIQ+ candidates or participants said yes. Then if you have a look at influencing their decision to run for politics, only 18% said yes, and that was the lowest out of all of those different kind of cohorts and compared to all respondents. Now, we find that quite interesting because our results kind of indicate that young LGBTIQ+ people in particular, they are motivated to take other forms of political action going forwards, but that does not necessarily look like running for politics. When we've done some of our qualitative analysis, a lot of that has come down to things like safety. So workplace safety is the top barrier preventing our change makers for considering running for politics. Second to that, they're concerned about not seeing themselves represented in politics, as well as then not feeling like they could make a change. So if you're just going to be appointed to power, but fundamentally you don't have enough power to change the system or advocate for the things that matter for you. And then finally, having a lack of access to resources, and that might be financial resources, it might be networks, being part of a party, and so on. As we know from previously, so representation does matter, and that mattered to 98% of our participants. And why they felt it mattered was primarily this kind of being heard, being listened to. That was what 71% of respondents spoke about. In addition to some of the other points there around seeing greater diversity and better policy outcomes, seeing people like me, distributing power and influence, and this notion of it being better for democracy. So if we flip that, so we asked before about barriers stopping people running for politics. Okay, well, what would actually proactively influence your choice to run for politics? Again, workplace safety and treatment came up as the #1 response, again, followed by representation and that ability to make change. Interestingly, confidence and experience is only down there at 8%. Now, this is really key because when we look at a lot of the programs designed to get more women into politics or young people into politics, I haven't seen any trying to get more LGBTIQ+ people into politics, but maybe there's a gap here. Anyway, a lot of these programs, they often focus on equipping young people or women with confidence, but they're not saying that that's what would be really helpful for them, right? So there's this really key, clear message that we think we've got enough experience and we've got enough confidence already. We don't need more of that. We need more workplace safety. We need more, feeling like we can make a change, all those sorts of things. Again, to flip it one more time, so a lot of the research focuses on getting people to politics, but we went one step further to ask, well, what would influence your decision to stay in politics? Now, we know this is somewhat hypothetical, given there was only one of the delegates who actually was in politics already. However, their responses are interesting. So whilst before the big barriers and the big motivators around workplace safety, Now it actually becomes about being able to make change as the top response. So I think this is really interesting if we think about those concepts of representation, and you might be familiar with Hannah Fennikel-Pitkin's works on 4 different types of representation. So there's this real desire that they don't just want to be a body in politics, they want to have influence and substantive representation in politics. This is just a bit of an aside, but we're not going to claim that we perfectly designed this study or the interventions, but as part of the Youth Summit, we ran pre and post surveys, basically to try and get an idea of all of these things we've been talking about, and see whether by taking part in some collective workshops and discussions about politics and unpacking their ideas, does it actually have any difference for young people? So we asked them, what words do you associate with politics? On the left, we see words like power, white, men, anger, unfair, inaccessible, old, frustrating, too hard, systemic discrimination, old white men. Racist, scary, lots of words. There's a few positive words, but it's pretty dark overall. If we look at after they had been part of our 2-day, discussions, workshops, so on, this exact same group of people, they answer this question quite differently. So they talk about change, power, community, opportunity, hope, activism, influence, possibility, collaboration. Now there's still things like lack of diversity, there's still men, there's still no representation, but it's far less of a common thing to what they talk about. Interestingly, so I know we talked about confidence not being a barrier. However, we did ask them before we had heard about their primary concerns, how confident would you feel running for politics? And before, 63% said not at all confident. After, only 9% said not at all confident. And a big majority, so 88%, said that they'd at least feel a little confident. And we felt, okay, for us, this highlights that even small scale interventions might make quite a bit of a difference. And if we're talking particularly about the lack of programs supporting LGBTIQ+ people into politics, maybe that's a good way to start. So that's some of the trends from the first study. The next one I want to run you through is this study we did called Risky Visibility, and it builds off a concept that Vivian Westwood developed out of aged care research, basically to describe this whole idea of if you're an LGBTIQ+ person and you're trying to get care, you've got a bit of risky visibility. Either you're out and so you don't get, culturally competent care, or, you're not out and so you don't get that culturally competent care, or you are out and you open yourself to homophobia, transphobia and biphobia. But either way, you've got this kind of riskiness to how visible or invisible you are. So we wanted to look at this in the context of politics. So just very generally, LGBTIQ+ individuals find that the hostility and harassment that is perceived as part of entering public office is just not worth the stress. And a Pew research found that a majority of LGBTIQ+ adults in the US had experienced online harassment. So 51% of them considered that abuse severe or sexualized in nature. So for us, it was just ahead of the 2022 elections here in Australia, where we were seeing a whole lot of new actors enter the space and likely a bit of a shake-up in government, which turned out to be the case. So we sought to answer this question: do LGBTIQ+ politicians face more harassment online than non-LGBTIQ+, so straight or cisgendered politicians? Fairly simple, not very sophisticated, but as I say, there's actually just not research in this space. So it's a totally new domain that we're trying to map. We chose 8 queer political candidates and 8 non-queer political candidates that was as similar as we could get in terms of their party, their kind of affiliation, their identity, all of these sorts of things to compare. And over a 6-week period, we used a Twitter API to scrape all of the tweets that they had received, either by comments or direct tweets, basically to try and understand online harassment on Twitter, or X now. So I've just included some candidates here. we looked at. Some of them are incumbent, some did win, others didn't, so on and so forth. And we had a comparator group as well. What we started to see in the results was that those who didn't have a centrist party, so perhaps a Greens or an independent candidate, that combined with having non-normative gender or sexuality or ethnicity, age, disability or background, and when I say non-normative, I mean non-normative to that political ecosystem as it is, and then receiving more identity or perceived identity-based harassment, kind of a limiting effect. I'll have to explain that a bit more in a sec. Basically, these sorts of things add up to what you might see as risky visibility. Whether a candidate is actively using their identity in their approach or policies did have a mediating effect. And again, if you happen to be a queer woman of colour, you are more likely to experience sexism, racism and homophobia all at once. I'll talk about the effect, this kind of limiting furthering effect of scrutiny of harassment in a sec, but basically there's all these sorts of compounding factors. We talk about how invisibility tended to exist where politicians may have been relatively unknown and have a low follower count. And we found that for those politicians, scrutiny or harassment was less prevalent. For those who are kind of visible, so politicians may be relatively known or followed, scrutiny and harassment more prevalent. However, harassment or scrutiny was largely targeted at policies or platform, so professional activities. For our non-queer candidates, the straight candidates, a lot of them were either invisible or had visibility here. But the real trend there was that the harassment was much more focused, or scrutiny was much more focused on their policy or party. What we found with LGBTIQ+ politicians, they faced this risky visibility. So it didn't matter whether they were known or not known, they still had the scrutiny or harassment they received was far more based on personal identity or their perceived identity. So much more sexist, vitriolic, and all of the rest. So we found that queer and non-queer candidates really face similar online harassment. So queer candidates only received 1% more harassment than non-queer candidates. But queer candidates were much more likely to face vitriolic, personal, sexist, homophobic, transphobic abuse. So we argue that this has ramifications, and this goes to the furthering effect that I talked about earlier. So if you can imagine, if you can say, well, all politicians face harassment and that's just that. So you could stop at that first line. However, that nature of that really personalized and sexist and vitriolic attacks is much more likely to have individual level impacts, we theorize, but also it's much less likely to further policy. So if all of your harassment, scrutiny, feedback is all around an individual, the way that they look or talk or whatever it might be, for queer folk, well, that's not ideal. But if that same level of harassment and scrutiny going to straight folk is about their policy or platform, well, maybe there's a possibility that that could have a beneficial effect on policy or platform. Maybe if they receive a whole lot of negative feedback about a policy stance, maybe that has the opportunity to improve the policy stance, whereas the critique that queer folk face, they just don't have that same furthering opportunity, I suppose. So no harassment or scrutiny is good. However, there's really specific ramifications of the types that these two groups face. So finally, before I hand over for questions, is the research. So this is in my book, The Face of the Nation, and a separate journal article on the experiences of queer women leaders in international affairs. The research involved analysis of 40 years of data from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Defence, Australian Federal Police and Department of Home Affairs. So our kind of premier international affairs agencies. Now they cover roles that are really broad, from, ADF military personnel, sworn police officers, to intelligence analysts, public servants, bureaucrats, all of the rest, ambassadors, etc. And I was really looking at those who are already ambassadors, commanders, chiefs, so quite senior levels of leadership. And I really wanted to understand, why do women remain underrepresented or unequal in international affairs? A subset of this research, and I did almost 80 interviews alongside gender data analysis from 40 years. We had a subset of people who were LGBTIQ+, and also a subset of people who weren't LGBTIQ+, but talked about how they were typified as queer and treated as if they were queer, particularly if they were single and had short hair, which was a very interesting finding from the research. But just to give you a status of the field of international relations, so it's always considered gender neutral, even though it is fundamentally a gendered sphere where access to power and resources is often dependent on or influenced by gender. Very thoroughly masculine sphere of influence where women's voices are considered inauthentic. It's a patriarchal stronghold, most male-dominated sphere within the state. There's an inherent precariousness for LGBTIQ+ identities, with LGBTIQ+ people often viewed with suspicion and caution, often considered a blackmail risk. So either not given the opportunities to be in international affairs, or they have to be completely closeted. And Marinucci argues that the oppression of women and the suppression of LGBTIQ experience are deeply entwined, particularly in this field of international affairs. So what I found was that queer women still face deep exclusion internationally, even though our national policies and laws, and there's been some changes. For people like ambassadors or commanders, because of visa requirements, their partners, even if they're married, might have to post internationally as their chauffeur or their maid in order to gain entry to the place that they are being posted to. The ramifications of this are, when disaster strikes, Fido, their fluffy dog, will get airlifted out, but not their wife, because she's the chauffeur or the maid. So these sorts of instances can really demonstrate some really deep challenges. Some people might be like, oh, they can still go with you. It's just a visa thing that they have to be listed as the chauffeur, but it has real implications. For many years, although I believe this has changed now, it also impacted on things like spousal benefits overseas as well. In addition to that, a lot of the folk that I interviewed, they'd spent their entire career, 30 plus years in the service, not able to be out, particularly for international affairs, which involves a lot of networking, events, hosting of functions. That's quite difficult to do. You're constantly inviting people into your home, but you cannot have your full home there, I suppose. When we talk about posting people overseas, so there's still 70 plus countries, around 70 countries that criminalise homosexuality. And despite greater overt celebration of pride in lots of ministries of foreign affairs, this is often in direct conflict with people's individual experiences. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news, which is still a little bit bad, is that women with wives may actually be best placed to fulfill the dual roles required of diplomacy. So we still talk a lot about any international posting, really requiring, they used to call it trailing spouse. So your spouse would trail after you, and they would do all of the arranging of basically diplomatic housework, we call it. So all of the key networking events, functions, organising. Way back in the day, they used to kind of feed and clothe and look after the diplomatic staff, because all the staff lived in the ambassador's residence. So this is an official role that is never paid, and it's not officially recognised as a role. So women who posted overseas with their husbands, so either their husbands tended not to go with them because it would be detrimental to their career to leave for a few years and then come back and restart. Or if they did go, they tended to opt out of doing the diplomatic housework, the organizational housework. As a consequence, women who did have wives, their wives were often more willing to do that unpaid labor. Now, it's not right that they should have to, but it is interesting that is one of the realities that is occurring. In addition to that, international posting does offer some freedom. So when you're overseas, you represent the nation, not, police or Sally or whatever. So a number of people I spoke with, they had experienced incredibly bad discrimination and really deeply entrenched homophobia here in Australia, and from their agency. They post overseas to Papua New Guinea, and they're just treated as the top representative in Papua New Guinea, and they are respected as such, even with their wife there beside them. The distance from headquarters and home and family can provide a level of freedom. And the research really found that even places that might have been typified as the most unfriendly, so Brunei, Papua New Guinea, parts of the Middle East, they were often okay as per participants' experiences. So Middle East, for instance, has a huge gay male population because largely wives and women ambassadors do not want to post there. So tends to be that you see a more concentration of gay or queer men who post to those regions. On the other hand, when this research was ongoing, Trump had just initiated the changes to the law, which meant that anyone who was entering the US and wanted a spousal visa, they needed to be married. Now, of course, there's only a handful of countries worldwide that allow same-sex marriage. So if you cannot get married to your long-term partner, you cannot get your partner a spousal visa in the States. So for the US, or even Norway, where there was a huge shooting recently at a Pride event a few years ago, places that you might consider to be better, but don't always seem to be that way. So the ramifications of these kind of three studies and some of the other broader work that we do is, there are both moral and strategic benefits from LGBTIQ+ representation in these spheres. And at the moral kind of level, it's what's right. At another moral level, it is government mandate. We have a representative democratic system. So any deficiencies there are deficiencies in our democracy. But we have, there's some growing research being done on what are the strategic or business case benefits too. But we also know that underrepresentation or unequal treatment of individuals has real ramifications. So not only in terms of whether people want to stay in these fields or go into them in the first place, their personal lives and the personal, very individualized impacts, but also that has, ramifications for the strength of democracy. So particularly that research around risky visibility, if the only time we're criticizing LGBTIQ+ focus, just to do with them and not their policies and platforms, that's also problematic. We're failing to have the range of debate that we should be. So I might just hand it over for questions. And yeah, very, very happy to hear your thoughts or considerations. Thanks.
I'm gonna pull the chat up. My computer's just frozen, so I can't get it.
Great.
I'll just grab the microphone.
So we'll go maybe first to questions in the room, but please do let us know if you have any questions online. I'm not sure if the audio was coming through, so you might have to put them in the chat, but see how we go.
Any questions in the room? I have a question. I was wondering if you could give a little bit more information about the workshop that you did with the change makers that went through it, because those results were really interesting to see, even at the end, especially like that a lot of them felt a bit more confident if they did want to go into that politics region. So yeah, I just wanted to know a little bit more about that workshop.
Yeah, absolutely. So the workshop itself was, so they were there for 2 days, and as part of the 2 days, they did everything from some sessions on safety, to leadership, to consent education, to climate change and gender equality, lots of different topics. But then on the second day, we had basically this half-day workshop that we ran. We took their responses right at the start before we'd done anything. But then we ran a workshop that was basically around what does politics mean to you? What do you see as the key barriers? What would really enable you? What kinds of political leadership have you seen that inspire you or that, I don't know, positively motivate you? So we basically broke it up in a World Cafe style thing. So we started with just questions to the audience, which we gathered on Mentimeter. Then everyone's broken up and we just rotated through the questions. And it was supposed to be youth-led. So we had facilitators who were other young people, basically. And so I think, we had about 12 of them, I suppose, about, tables of about 8 or so. And it was interesting because it was really very much so a, get it all out there. But the progression of the way that we asked for questions was more about what's your current ideas? What would you like to see? What would be the pathways there? How would you redefine? It was almost a process of redefining politics in action right there. And then we just asked those same questions right at the end. So I don't know, we didn't particularly, I think if you did it again, you could do lots more and you could develop it up much more seriously. Our real intention was that I suppose we were concerned that we had lots of amazing, ambitious change makers, but this was actually held a week after the referendum last year, and we were concerned that there was a lot of basically sadness, anger, feeling disenfranchised for the system, all of the rest. And so part of it actually was also just to provide space to unpack and think about not just leaving young people in a state of nothing can ever change, but thinking about how would you make things change and try to close that circle. So
very interesting. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question. So just following on from that, I'm curious as to if you heard back from any of the young people that attended, what their engagement was after that experience, and I guess any longer term impacts that it had.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We haven't to date done a follow-up survey or anything, but so the young people who led that workshop are part of the dual youth committee. So this is a committee that's it's chaired by Chanel Contos, and it's got just hugely empowering and amazing group of people part of it. But those 16 young people, we've met with them multiple times since, and they've fed back anecdotal kind of oh, so-and-so is running for this, or so-and-so is doing this initiative now. Our intention, though, is to run the next Youth Summit in October this year, but in Canberra, do similar sort of thing. What we haven't considered, and I guess this is prompting a consideration, is can we track any longitudinal changes, at least for a percentage of that cohort that were there last year, and whether we could involve them again this year as well as some new folk would be really helpful. Because I guess one thing that we're unsure about, or what we're seeing, is yes, lots of amazing new people flooding the scene, but also a lot of people leaving also. So I think fatigue and the ramifications of trolling, some of the harassment that these people are facing is unbelievable, and such a, I don't know, this is the beginning of their careers, right? So that kind of is very concerning for us.
It strikes me that the summit that you've organized kind of helped to create for these young people the community, the representation that they were looking for, the voice. And so I would be interested to see how that actually over time, if that community stayed together, at least pockets of it, and the impact that had.
And we to do this research, we partnered with an organisation called Raise Our Voice Australia, as well as the Australian Human Rights Commission before they became the Wisankani First Nations Gender Justice Institute here at ANU. And the great thing about the Raise Our Voices, the other org that we partnered with, is they like, that is essentially their mandate. They run like incubator programs for young change makers who want to take their ideas to policy impact. So by having them there, like they shared a lot of onwards resources in terms of come join our program now, which is that they've got funding to continue to do it and all of those things that we didn't have at the time. So yeah, hopefully, I mean, that's a really nice reflection, but yeah, hopefully it's
Yeah, fantastic. I don't want to hog the microphone. I'll pass it up.
Thank you, and thanks, Jo Nicole, for organising it. It's really great to celebrate this week. And thanks for the presentation. You're a great presenter. I have a bit of a question that's a bit muddled in my head, so just bear with me. Just a bit of thinking I've been doing sort of personally and a bit of reading. And this is your sphere of expertise, not mine. I'm a social scientist, but in a different way. I can see that there's a bit of kind of debate at the moment, particularly in the left, around that clash between identity politics and that more kind of what's being described as traditional kind of leftist ideals around equity and change. And what I really took from your data is that, you know, despite that there is some argument that, oh, the left is all about identity politics now, what young people are telling you, it's less about representing them as a gay person or a trans person and more about them wanting to make change, but a lack of equity in the workplace for them to do so. I'm just wondering if I'm just kind of drawing on random things in my head or what, you know, if that makes sense for you in your research and if you can just reflect on that a little.
Yeah, I mean, you summarized that really nicely. So I think that yeah, that really resonates. I think the thing that is like, you know, I guess often the backlash piece is, you know, that whole, well, this is just a woke agenda sort of thing. Like if you happen to gather people in a room who've never been part of those spaces before, it's a woke agenda, and it's like, well, it's not any different than you gathering all of your blokes in a room over here, right? Like we wouldn't call that, you know, like I don't know what we would call it, a lot of things, but but my point being, we don't necessarily call it identity politics. It's been so normalized that that's politics. And this is identity politics, as if they're the ones with an identity and those people are neutral blank slates that equally make policy. And so I think that is interesting. I think that's part of the pushback movement that we see. So I think when we're thinking about the journal articles that come out of that research, I'd be interested to explore that a little bit more, because I think that was surprising to me, just how important that ability to make change is. But of course, that's why people go into this, right? They don't go into it to represent themselves, really. Like, you know, that's a benefit maybe, but they go into it to change systems. So I think remembering that is actually quite important, because at the end of the day, you know, people want good policy. People are trying to change policy. That's the most important thing, rather than representing the LGBTIQ+ community per se. Yeah,
nice, thank you. Glad that got out of my head.
Yeah, no, it was really, no, thank you for communicating it. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'm not
comments on
seeing
that?
anything.
I have another one.
Yeah.
We have time. I was just curious if you could talk about maybe the differences you see in Australia compared to other countries that you've spent time, or places that if you've done research in other areas as well. So in this space of representation of LGBTQI in politics, how does that compare to other countries?
Yeah, so I guess I haven't specifically studied this, so I'll give you some overarching reflections, I guess. So I mean, the US has greater quantity of LGBTIQ+ people in politics that we know of. However, my sense of the US political system is it's just so fractured, and I don't know, I think on the more tangible level, I feel like we're probably making a little bit more inroads into actually making systems better. I think the, you know, anti-trans stuff in the US and in the UK is just so loud and really constraining the space for LGBTIQ plus folk. I think so. I just spent last week in Cambodia working with the Cambodian government ostensibly about gender equality, but the things we kept hearing from them is they want Australia's help when it comes to same-sex marriage, and like how they've been asked by the United Nations Periodic Review to consider legislating for same-sex marriage. And so they're like, well, Australia did this recently, what can we learn from you? And so I think that that's good that we're seeing some more moves in the region. But reflections from Cambodia was that if you're talking about LGBTIQ plus inclusion, do not frame it as a human rights issue. And basically a lot of countries, there's a lot of tension, a lot of sensitivity over human rights, and other states saying to them, your human rights record is terrible, and we are going to condone you for this, and we're going to stop trade because of this and whatever. Human rights is a very sensitive issue, but LGBTIQ plus inclusion, as opposed to rights, that's actually fairly non-controversial in a lot of places. So I think that's quite an interesting move, which I feel like that's something that's a bit more recent that I've been noticing. Yeah, so look, we'll see. We're getting much more, we've got Penny Wong and other sorts of global leaders who are, we're seeing much more high profile LGBTIQ plus representation. I think one of my PhD students is doing research on LGBTIQ plus diplomats, and he gets a lot of pushback from organisations internationally because his is a global survey, and they're like, we don't need more LGBTIQ plus people in representation. And he always says, it's not about whether you need them or not, it's the fact that they're there. So let's understand those circumstances. And I think that's probably my big other observation is that it is one of the only identities, although not the only, that is relatively invisible unless you choose to make it more visible, right? So I guess that notion of passing becomes really prevalent, and therefore I suppose for organisations reflecting on LGBTIQ plus inclusion, I think that's probably the message. It's not even necessarily, we're not even having a conversation about getting more LGBTIQ plus people, it's just recognising they're there already.
Yeah.
And sexual diversity is just, gender diversity is so much more broad.
Yeah. I think that's a great point to finish up on. Please, round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining in person and online. Next week's our last seminar for the semester. So please join us. We have PhD candidate Victoria Thomas will be doing her final oral presentation. So please do come and support. And we'll have our usual social hour afterwards as well to finish off the semester. And now we have tea and coffee if anyone would like to stick around. All right. Thanks everyone online.